Okay, so we're going to talk about genetics a little bit, and we've been discussing meiosis, which is where you make your sperm and your egg cells, and that creates, that takes the information from mom and dad and passes it on to the children. So what we're going to look at now is how are these things passed on, and what in type of ways do certain things pass on. And so we have two terms that we need to talk about. The first is heredity. That's the actual passing on of characteristics. So whether you have blue eyes or brown hair or blonde hair, the heredity is passing from the parent to the children. Genetics is studying how these characteristics are passed and like what patterns arise. So heredity is the passing of the genes, whereas genetics is studying how do they what patterns arise when they are passed. All right, so most of what we know about genetics comes from a guy named Gregor Mendel. He's known as the father of genetics. He was actually an Austrian monk who worked with pea plants. And the reason why he worked with pea plants was because, one, they were easy to work with, two, he could grow them in his garden, and three, they had very easy characteristics to look at, such as how tall they were, how short they were, what color their flowers were, how their pea pods looked, and a bunch of other stuff. And he really was one of the first to look at how do you have certain characteristics in the parent plant and what happens when the children plant grow. How are those characteristics passed on? And in this picture here, you actually see a picture of Gregor Mendel right here. He is actually holding a pea plant because he was actually very, very dedicated to his work. All right. So what did he have to say? So a couple of things before we get into his exact laws, we have to talk about are some terms. So when we're going to be talking about genetics, we're going to be talking about a genetic cross. And all that means is that it's a fancy word for mating two organisms. So in the picture over here, you see you have a purple flower and you have a white flower. And so a genetic cross would be a mating, taking the pollen from one and adding it to the flower of another and fertilizing that plant. Now, a purebred is something that is uniform throughout. So like a purebred Chihuahua would have just Chihuahua characteristics in it. There is no mix of other species of dog or other breeds of dogs. It's just Chihuahua. So if you have a purple flower here, like this one here, that means that all of the flowers that came before this were purple. The same goes for the white one here. So we say these are purebred because it is just either purple or just only white. Now we have three generations which we'll typically see. The P generation is pretty easy. It's the parent, so that's who we start with. The next generation, the F1 generation, or the first filial generation, is what is produced from the parents. Okay, so you mate the two parents. In this case, we made a purple and a white, and we got all purples. Okay, so the F1 generation is kind of like if you have a family come from Africa, and both parents are African, but when they get to the U.S., they have children, so that those children are known as the first generation in America. Okay, then the F2 generation is the second filial generation, and this is when you take two organisms from the F1 generation and mate them. So it would be, in this case, you have two purple plants, and when you mate them, you get three purple and one white. But these are the children, these are basically the grandchildren of the parent. So you've got the parent, then you have the children in the F1, and in the F2 you have the grandchildren. So a lot of times, if we go back to our analogy of, or the example of the people from Africa, if the firstborn children who are in America, they have children, they are said to be second-born Americans, or second-generation Americans. So you have the parent, you have the F1, and the F2 generation. The reason why we're going over this is because a lot of times when we're talking about genetics, you'll hear me use these terms, so I want you to be familiar with the terms. Alright, So more vocabulary terms. A trait is anything that can be passed on. So your eye color, your hair color, the color of your skin, the features in your face, like the way your eyes are shaped, the ways your nose looks, things like that. That is a trait. So if we're talking about plants, you can talk about how tall they are, how short they are, what color flowers they give. Those are traits. And all traits are coded for in what we call a gene. So remember, we talked about this before last semester before Christmas break. Remember, gene was the section of DNA that had the instructions for a protein. And that's what carries the information for the traits. And genes are passed from the parent to the offspring or the parent to the child. Now, you're not always going to have the same form of a gene. So it's like when I give a test. I don't always give the same version of the test. You typically have a test A and a test B. Sometimes I do test C, blah, blah, blah. The different forms of the test, are, in this case, or the different forms of the gene, is what we call an allele. So an allele is an alternative form or a different version of a gene. So you can have, in this case, in this picture, they show one allele is purple, while one allele is white. So you can have two different versions of flower color here. So this gene is for the color of the flower, but we have two versions of it. You have a purple one and you have a white one. And so typically you'll have two versions of each characteristic or each feature that you're looking at, or each trait. All right, so the first rule that Mendel came up with was the rule of dominance. And what this said was that certain alleles or certain versions of each gene, are going to be dominant over the others. Okay, the dominant one will always be expressed. If as long as you have one dominant allele, then you will show the dominant trait. So if we say we have purple versus white, so we're looking at purple versus white. So we're looking at the flower color. That means that purple is going to be dominant. Let's say purple's dominant. We represent this by a capital letter. So if we're going to go with P, that means the allele for P, if it has at least one capital P, that means it will show purple. Okay. Now recessive is basically the other one. So in this case, it would be white. It gets covered up by the dominant allele. So you have to have two copies of the recessive allele for it to show up. That means you have to have two copies of that version in order for it to show up. And the way we represent this is by a little p. So in this case, we do a little p for white. So big P would be purple, little p would be white. So again, capital letter is dominant, lowercase letter is recessive. And you have to have, if you have the dominant allele, it will show the dominant trait. The other way you can think about this is if you've ever been in a group of people where you have someone who's really loud and outspoken, they have a dominant personality. They are going to talk over other people typically, and everyone who's around them will maybe more recessive. They don't talk as much. Or if you have someone who's really quiet and someone who's really dominant, the dominant one is going to talk more or talk over the recessive one. All right, the second law that Mendel came up was the law of segregation. And like I mentioned before, every organism gets two copies of one gene. You get one from mom, one from dad, or two versions. You have two alleles. Now, when the gametes are being made, remember the gametes are the sex cells. When the sperm and egg are being made, the different alleles are separate. They're segregated when they're being made. So you're not gonna always have all of one allele go one direction, all one of the other allele go the other direction. Let's look at this example here. So you have a big T and a little t in each starting thing. Okay, so let's say that this here is like an egg and this is a sperm. Okay, so when we're looking at the egg, it's going to break down. You're going to get one big T, one little t, and for the same for the sperm, you get one big T, one little t. Now, once you make the gametes, remember when you want to make a baby, you got to take a sperm and an egg and you got to combine it back together so it has the right number of chromosomes. Well, what the law of segregation says is that it's random how these mix up. Okay, so you can have this one here and this one here come together, the two big T's, to make where you have a big T and a big T. Okay, an egg with a big T, a sperm with a big T, and you get a baby that has a big T, big T. Or you can take that same big T here from the egg, but then take the little t from the sperm and get a big T, little t. Okay, so what it's saying is that each version of the gene for the sperm and the egg are separated, and then when they combine back together, it's random. And this explains why you may see something in the parent generation that will disappear in the first generation, the F1 generation, and then reappear. Like when we were talking about earlier, the flowers, you started with a purple and a white. Well, then when you got to the first generation, you just had purple, but then when you get to the second generation, the white shows up again. So this helps explain why that trait disappears. All right. The third law of Mendel is independent assortment. And what this is saying is when you're forming the gametes, when you're going through meiosis, that each chromosome is going to line up or separate independent from one another. Okay, so remember that we have a homologous chromosome. So you have, like if you look in this picture, you have a blue one from dad and a yellow one from mom. Okay, and so what it's saying is, let me rewrite that so it's a little bit clearer. Okay, so blue again is dad and yellow is mom. Okay, so what it's saying here is when they line up in metaphase 1, okay, remember they're paired up in metaphase 1. Okay, you've got your dad and your mom, and then the pair is going to separate. Okay, so that means that the blue one and the yellow one are going to separate. But if you notice here, you've got blue on top and then blue on bottom. Okay, that's one version of it. Or you can have the other one where blue is on top for both of them. So, meaning that if dad is blue, you're not necessarily going to get where all of the blues are on the top and all the yellows are on the bottom. That can happen, but it's not necessarily going to happen. You can have them mixed up. Each pair is lining up separate from the other chromosomes. So we say that they are sorted independently. All right. So going back to the alleles, that basically sums up what Mendel said. So and we're going to continue to talk about his different ideas as we go through genetics. But let's delve into alleles a little bit more and talk specifically about the different forms that the alleles can take. All right. In physical science, you talked about homogeneous and heterogeneous mixtures. Homogeneous mixtures like chocolate milk. It's all uniform. It's all the same. You can't tell the chocolate from the milk. It's all mixed up really well. Heterogeneous is like if you're making chocolate chip cookie dough. You can see the chocolate chips. You can see the different parts of the mixture. Or like Chex Mix. You can see the different parts of the heterogeneous mixture. So remember that homo, the prefix homo means same, and hetero means different. So that means if we're talking about the different versions of the allele, a homozygous allele is going to have the same allele at both points. Now, I haven't talked about this before. A locus on a chromosome is a location. It's like a situation or like a part of the chromosome. So the locus is where the gene actually occurs. Okay, so if you look here, you have wrinkled and wrinkled in this example. So they're both versions of the allele are the same. A heterozygous is going to be different. So in this case, you've got a wrinkled on one, but round on the other. So there's two different versions of the allele on the pair of chromosomes. So The homozygous is like if you, like when I'm giving you a test, you just happen to notice that the person next to you has the same version. You both have test B. But then a heterozygous situation would be like you get version A, they get version B. So it's just a difference of situation. So homozygous again, same alleles. Heterozygous is different alleles. All right. Now to actually take the information from the DNA and talk about how it relates to what shows up in a person or organism, it's explained as the expression. So expressing or showing a trait. Again, remember that a trait is anything that you can inherit. So skin color, eye color, hair color, things like that. And we use one letter of the alphabet, A, B, C, whatever, to represent one trait. So for eye color, we can use E. For hair color, we can use H. So there's always going to be one letter of the alphabet for each trait. And you have two ways to express it. You have the genotype, which is the genetic makeup. Okay, so this is what's in your genes. The genotype is the genes. So geno equals genes. Phenotype, or pheno, equals the physical expression. Like, what do you actually physically see? So here in this picture, you have the DNA that codes for the color of the mouse. So the genotype is the DNA, what shows up in the alleles. The phenotype is the actual color of the fur on the mouse. Okay, so the phenotype is what do you see on the mouse. So genotype is gene, phenotype is the physical expression. Now, with genotype, you can actually have 3 different options. Okay, and this goes back to this connects back to the homozygous and heterozygous. For the genotype, first for homozygous, you can have homozygous dominant. Now, like I mentioned, you will have 2 alleles for each trait because you get one from mom, one from dad. So homozygous dominant is where you have 2 capital letters because it's dominant. Remember, capital letters are shown by being dominant. Now we're going back to our flower color. So remember, remember that big P was purple and little p was white. Okay, so if it's homozygous, which means the same, and it's dominant, that means you're going to have 2 capital P's. If it's homozygous recessive, that means you're going to have 2 little p's because recessive is the smaller one. If it's heterozygous, that means it's different. You're going to have 1 big letter and 1 little letter. And the big one typically comes first. So homozygous is the same. So dominant means you have 2 capital. Homozygous recessive means you have 2 little because it's recessive. And heterozygous means you have 1 of each. Now, remember, I said if you have at least 1 capital letter, you will show the dominant trait or the dominant version. So, for the homozygous dominant and the heterozygous, they both show purple. They will show the dominant one. To have the recessive, you have to have homozygous recessive because the dominant trait will cover up the recessive allele. So if you have a big letter and a little letter, the big letter covers that little letter. Alright, so let's do an example. So, freckles are dominant to no freckles. Okay, so we're using capital F for freckles, little f for no freckles. What are the possible genotypes and according phenotypes are there? So, you have 3 versions of the genotypes. You have 2 capital letters, so big F, and because it's capital, you're going to have freckles. You have big F, little f, which is, again, you have 1 capital letter, which is freckles. And you have 2 little f's. Okay, so that in that case, it's no freckles. Remember, if you have a capital letter, it's freckles, because it tells you right there. If you have a lowercase letter, you have to have 2 of them, no freckles. Alright, another example. Red hair color is recessive to brown. Using little r for red hair and big R for brown hair, what possible genotypes and according phenotypes of the allele pairs are there? So we're going to do the same thing. It's same three combinations. You got big R. Okay, so you got big R, big R, big R, and little r, little r. So there's always going to be your three versions of the genotypes. Big R, or big, big little, and then little little. Just depends on what letter you're using. So we have two dominant. So in that case, brown is dominant. So we have two big R's. That's going to be brown. If you have a big R and a little r, well, you have at least one big R. So again, that's going to be brown. And if you have two little r's, well, that's recessive. So you're going to show the recessive trait, which is red hair. Okay, please make sure that you have filled in the entire note sheet, because we're going to work on a practice sheet tomorrow. If you have any questions, I will be back tomorrow and I'll go over these again.